I really enjoyed this conversation with Professor Mike Munger of Duke University, whose class I took back in 2014 in my first semester of college. I invited him on the podcast after I had listened to a recent appearance he did on Econ Talk, which is another podcast hosted by Hoover Institution fellow Russ Roberts, in which they discussed the future of the universities in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic. I had a lot of thoughts in response to listening to that podcast, and so I decided to email Professor Munger and invite him to discuss. He was really gracious with his time and his ideas. I really appreciate it, so I hope you enjoy the conversation. And all right, now we're recording. Professor Munger, thank you so much for joining me on this lovely Wednesday evening.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So I want to just give some context for the people who are going to hear this about our conversation. So you recently spoke to Russ Roberts, who hosts a podcast called Econ Talk. It was episode number 750. And you talked about the future of the universities, especially in the post-coronavirus world, and obviously currently in the existing pandemic world. And I think it's been a hot topic on a lot of people's minds, particularly as tuition costs have gotten higher and higher the last several years, to the point where I think in certain places they're upwards of $70,000 now. And so I think this has caused a lot of people to think about what alternatives could be. And at the moment, they're not necessarily great ones. However, because of a lot of the factors you talked about, like the unbundling of the universities and their various functions, I think a lot of people are thinking harder and harder about that and what that might look like. But before we kind of get into the unbundling and what the universities really do and what they're really about, because that was kind of fascinating, I kind of wanted to start with how did we get here? How do we get to a point where the universities feel like they're not available for everyone, like their mission has become kind of confused, and we can talk more about that too, where they're generally in this precarious position? Because I think that it didn't start with COVID. I think a lot of this stuff were kind of undercurrents just below the surface, and the pandemic was kind of the match that needed to light the fire.
Universities started in Italy. They were a place to learn religion. Modern universities started in Germany in the late 19th century, and all of the what are now American universities were modeled after the German universities, and the approach they wanted to take was Wissenschaft, or science. So they went, Harvard, Princeton they were seminaries. So they turned to science, and in some ways they turned to social science, because they were trying to create a kind of new humanist person. But as time went by, universities also came to be seen as finishing schools, and they were also places where you could meet people. So I have a friend who went to Harvard. He didn't actually much like Harvard, but he still keeps in touch with a woman he met there, who is now the president of a country in Africa. She was the daughter of the president, and it's supposed to be a democracy, but it turns out that it's a hereditary democracy. So if you look at some of the people he met as first years at Harvard, they're now running companies and countries. And being able to make those sorts of connections is another thing that's important why people want to go to universities in the United States. So for a very long time, no more than 10% of people went to universities, and it was seen, I think correctly, largely as a waste of time for most people. But then we had this idea of leveling where everyone should go to university. And a lot of the large state universities, I used as an example, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. One of my sons went to Duke and one went to UNC. Now, the only people who can go to UNC in state are those that could probably also go to Duke, because their test scores are really high. They have really good performance in high school. So what we have is we have some private universities, Duke, University of Pennsylvania, the Ivy League schools. They're very expensive. But if anything, they're worth even more than that, because we saw the recent scandal where people were willing to pay $100,000 or more to bribe someone to help their kid get into college. So if anything, I offended some people. I said on the podcast, you probably heard, if anything, universities aren't charging enough. Well, that's not true. They're charging too much. But in terms of the value that people perceive that they receive at the elite universities, they're still willing to pay even more than that. Well, if you go to UNC, you pay $6,000 a semester. It's pretty cheap. So the only people at UNC are those that are so rich that they're being subsidized by the taxes of poor people whose children have no chance of going to that college. So the two things that we've got are the elite private colleges that are grossly overpriced and they're only for the wealthy, and the elite public colleges, which are grossly underpriced and they're only for the wealthy. How in the world did we come to this system? The other thing is that we now have many state universities that it's not clear that it's worth the time and the money that people are spending. People are spending 5 or 6 years, they're having to work the whole time. It seems to me that the system is badly broken. And so on the econ talk that you're talking about, I talked about a metonymy, or a way of representing the value propositions of universities. And you probably noticed that I did not mention the classroom. One of the rooms was not the classroom. Well, that was a long answer to your question, but that's kind of the background of how we got here.
So I completely agreed with it. And I think it's funny that people got offended by that. So for further context, how I know you, I actually went to Duke before I eventually graduated from Harvard after transferring. And I took your class, Intro to Political Economics, my freshman year in 2014. And one of the kind of insights I gained from it, one of the most valuable ones, I hope this is one you wanted us to take away, was was about price gouging, actually. And the visceral repulsion people have to it, yet that kind of masks the real distribution problems that arise from that. That if you don't allow price gouging, things don't go to the people to whom they're really worth the most. And I actually think, in sort of like you're saying with colleges, I don't know that people should be offended by that, because to me, one of the big problems that stood out is it is worth more to some people who can pay for it than $70,000. I think the scandal you refer to was actually just the tip of the iceberg. I think there are probably people who pay 10 times that if they can afford it. But the problem is that I think, and you mentioned this too, it's become in a lot of ways a rent-seeking contest where for the people who can afford it, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, they're able to prop up the price for everybody else because they can afford it and it kind of doesn't matter. And then the people who really need it can't get it.
Well, imagine what universities could do. And in some ways, you spent some time at Duke, and I'm sure it was true at Harvard. Duke and Harvard miss very few chances to hold you by the ankles and shake money out of your pockets.
Absolutely.
So the housing, the food program, they're looking for every way they can to charge you. They could do this a different way. They could auction seats. And so, forget this entrance exam. We'll just auction seats. And so the first seat, the most expensive one, maybe that's $1 million.
Might be more.
It would be a lot. They would make more money if they would auction it, but they don't. What they do instead is they have a fixed level of tuition, and then they say that we're going to choose the best people. And your experience at Harvard, my hearing from people at Harvard, would say a lot of the reason why going to Harvard is valuable is it really is true. The other people are awesome. The faculty are fine. You don't always see them, but the really awesome people are the other people in the dorm, in the dining hall, and the people you go to have coffee with, a remarkable set of connections. If you actually work at that, you're kind of set for life. You have a lot of people that you can talk with. Well, in order to compete for that, since you can't compete by money, and I said this on the podcast too, I got several hate emails about it. I said, we're not admitting people based on their accomplishments. We're admitting people based on their willingness to lie about their accomplishments. And so that's the rent-seeking contest. I started a nonprofit in Africa. I created a symphony for the children of Cleveland. Well, you probably did something like that, and you got a letter from somebody saying it. But we're accumulating things as if it's a set of merit badges rather than doing things that have intrinsic value for your community, and then saying, and I did these things, and that's why you should admit me. So we've actually inverted it. The cause and effect is inverted. People at top high schools are encouraged to do things so they can go to college. It's not that they go to college because they did these things.
I think that's a large part of the problem, and that certainly stacks up with my experience. I am originally from New York City, and it's funny because I think your personal story probably affected your views on this stuff in a certain way, right? You, as you discussed on the podcast, you didn't come from a family of means. You went to Davidson, and it was an experience that through the academics and through being in that college opened your mind and changed your life. I am from New York City. I went to what you'd call an elite private school. Fortunately for me, my audience isn't big enough that I'm going to get a hate email for saying that yet. Hopefully one day, but and that's exactly what it was like. I don't want to go into too many specifics that'll get me in trouble with my high school or with people I know, but it was, suffice to say, it was all about faking accomplishments and who had the best fake 501c3 or who was the captain of this sports team that they kind of weren't even really part of, or not nonprofits. I said that captain of what, not captain, head of whatever club that they founded out of nowhere in 2 years.
They founded, yes, they also founded it.
And it's a million things like that. And by the way, what I found really amazing, and another thing you said that I'd be surprised if this didn't get you some hate, is in a way that actually stacks up with how real life is now too. In the Twitter and Facebook world, and we can go further down that path because it's kind of pessimistic, I think, but in a way, this actually does prepare people well for real life.
Influencers. These people are learning how to be influencers. That's all there is to it, is to be able to list the things that you did. And other people say, that's so cool, I'm going to follow them. So the nature of being an influencer, we're actually training exactly people for that. I wouldn't say that if you go to an elite high school, you are trying to go to a top college. The people who are trying to get into college did not make this game. They're trying to win it. If the rules were different, they would behave better. As it is, this is the only way to compete. And so given the rules, that's how they're doing it. So I don't think anybody is acting badly in the system, but the system is not performing well.
That's kind of an amazing insight too, because it's kind of intuitive, but it's actually not that obvious. That it's not that any one person or select group of people is behaving particularly badly. It's that the incentive system is really bad.
Yes.
Terrible in fact. And to me, at least, I would wonder how many people do you think there were like you who would be ripe for that kind of experience, that they have the intellectual seeds for it that can't get it?
There's no way I would get into Davidson now. I think I said on the podcast, I made C's and D's in high school. My high school was 50-50 racially. We're extremely poor. During the winter, they would close school so we could go and burn tires in the groves so that the orange groves wouldn't freeze. So if the temperatures are going to go below freezing, we would go burn stuff. And they would close school because it was a farm community. I got into Davidson because I did well on the SAT. And you can't go to a place like Davidson now unless you have 5 AP courses that you got 4s or 5s on. My high school didn't have AP courses. There was no such thing at my high school. So I've actually talked to the director of admissions at Duke about this, and he says, yes, it's a problem, but AP courses are a really good way to distinguish. So the question is, how do you find the kids who would benefit and actually who could do the work, but whose high schools don't have AP courses, who don't have SAT training? So Duke makes a point, and Harvard does this also. If you get in, admissions is need blind. We will pay your way, and not with loans, a full grant, free tuition. But no one has a chance of getting in unless they have AP courses and the SAT training and started a 501c3. So in effect, we're missing the people that policy, it sounds pretty good. And we do give out a lot of financial aid, that's true. But we're missing this is solipsistic, but it's not surprising. We are missing me. I have no chance of going to college. And of course, I think that's important.
And what's amazing about what you just said is that especially recently, the SAT has been under assault. I believe that it's no longer being required at some of the schools.
It's optional many places, which makes the problem worse. It makes the problem much worse because now all we have is AP courses and did you start a 501c3? And some poor kid who's working after school has no hope of doing those things. They have some hope of taking the SAT.
So looking at that, right? So why is it we have the price gouging example that I mentioned at the beginning, right? Now we have auctioning seats, which again, I think maybe would help in some ways, but so many people are so morally repulsed by just viscerally that it's a non-starter. Getting rid of the SAT, I think, is something that I think largely it's been under the guise of leveling the playing field. But like you just said, it doesn't really do that. So when you exist in a world like that where incentives are against it, and at every level incentives exist to signal, right? And I want to talk more about signaling too. And as far as your metonymy of the admissions office, we'll get more into that. But where can you even start with something like that? How can you even start to level the playing field when it seems like all the solutions that people want are ones that feel good but actually make it worse?
The difficulty is that not everyone can go to an elite college, and its eliteness is partly there by virtue of the fact that it's really hard to get into. So there will never be enough. And so in a way, you're right, this is like price gouging. The problem is that there's no good way to allocate this because it's scarce. The fairest way is the one that seems unfair in a way, because the SAT score is biased in the sense that there are big disparities in race, but it is some correlation underlying it with ability and training and preparation. All the other things are actually worse. And so the same thing is true with price gouging. I would rather have low prices and full shelves. You can't have both. So what we do is our choice is between full shelves or low prices and empty shelves. At universities, what we probably should do, and we do this to some extent, we have one group that gets in because they're legacies or because they're going to pay the full amount. And then we try to diversify the class. Then we also, though, have problems because of court cases, and Harvard and Princeton have both had this problem. They're more or less explicitly biased against Asians. They don't say it, but in effect, there's a quota on the number of Asians because they would satisfy the other criteria very well. Now you're looking for diversity. I understand that diversity is useful because you want people to have the experience of seeing people that are not like themselves. So we've backed ourselves into a corner where up is down and left is right. We're using words to mean something different from what they appear to mean. So I don't know what we should do. I think the best thing that we probably could do is continue to use the existing system, but make more of an effort to beat the bushes for people that are poor but willing to work hard.
So this is where I would start with the unbundling aspect of it, right? So in Econ Talk, you outlined basically, like you said, not the classroom, but 4 other main functions of the university. One of them, which to me at least ranks, I would say, 4th out of those, was the clock tower, which stands for kind of order, being somewhere on time, which is valuable. But out of those 4, I would say it's maybe the least important. There is also the admissions office, which stands for kind of signaling, the idea that there's something attached to you. And this becomes particularly important, at least in my mind, as the universities have become more pre-professional and they become kind of job factories. We can talk more about that too. There is the fraternity or sorority house or student union. I appreciated that in Econ Talk, of all places, you use the word trolling. So I'll give you credit for that, which kind of stands for social life, which again, I think is an extremely important part of college. And that's the Animal House fantasy a lot of people have. And frankly, I think animates a lot why a lot of people want to go. And lastly, there's the stadium, which at Duke would be Cameron, which is an iconic one. And I was lucky enough to go to some games while I was there. And it's a really special experience. I went to the North Carolina game my freshman year with my dad, who's an alum, which was awesome. That's the best sports experience I've ever had anywhere. So sure. with all 4 of those things, right, you start to talk about unbundling and how you could do that. Now, one way to do that was MOOCs, which are massive online open courses, massive open online courses. So kind of digital school, which is being forced on us right now. Another way is Google, for example, is offering basically a certification program, which will give you a direct pipeline. This is a new thing, direct pipeline into some of their roles like product manager, high paying, very good jobs, great trajectories. And so now the problem with unbundling is, of course, like you said, transactions cost. It's hard to get all 4 of these things in one place. When
you got it a 5th, because you're talking about courses. Courses would be the 5th.
Yes. Yeah. Well, right. Courses would be the 5th. And again, I agree that they're probably the least important in that bundle.
They're important, but they're the one that you can get piped in.
Yes. That's not what people are paying $70 or $100 or $200 or $500,000 for.
I think that's not true.
Really?
I think we could pipe in excellent courses and they would still pay for the other 4.
So you're saying you think if you could get the other 4 with Zoom courses or whatever, or MOOCs.
Well, they'd have to be excellent. Right.
Oh, okay. So I'm not disagreeing with that. I'm just saying the way it exists right now before COVID, I think that we both agree that those 4 things are what people were prioritizing when they make those decisions. Yeah. So if we look at admissions, right, the admissions office and signaling, that clearly is a big part of it. Like you said about Harvard, right? A graduation speaker of mine actually said, what you learn at Harvard is how to sound like you went to Harvard. And yeah.
It is funny though, when you ask someone that went to Harvard, where'd you go? Harvard. You have to be careful not to brag about it.
There's no good way to say it. There's no way around it. You can't say a small school in Cambridge because that's horrible. Yeah. That's worse. Yeah. But with the signal though, the signal is enormously valuable. And I think of all those things, it's actually the easiest one to quantify. You can put it down to what numbers of people work in investment banks or consulting firms or tech firms and what income they make. And so I think that is a huge part of it. And I think that is maybe part of the problem right now, that people who already can afford to do this are paying for the opportunity for their kids to make the income they make. And again, not vilifying anybody, it's incentives, but the problem is the people who most need that income bump lose it by not getting this opportunity.
Right. And what are the schools supposed to do?
That's a great question. My concern with unbundling is this. I think the idea to me, I actually recently had an argument with someone about this. Someone suggested to me that, and this was a moral kind of sentiment of theirs, that the college experience is so valuable and everybody just is entitled to it and deserves it, such that even if you have to take on $50,000 of student debt, you should do that. To which I said, that doesn't make a lot of sense. I said that makes no sense.
Maybe a total of 50,000. I would say 50,000 is the over-under. So if your total debt after 4 years is 50,000, that's iffy. There's people with 250,000.
Right. And that's where the problem comes in, that compounds and it hangs over you for the rest of your life. And so I think the idea that everybody can access this and that people like yourself back then could access this and have that opportunity is great. But when you get lost in the cycle that we're in, it's impossible. And so what should the colleges do about it? I don't know what the current colleges should do about it. I think that there might have to be a move to unbundling, but it's going to look bad. That's my concern. I think it's going to look bad enough that people are going to have a problem with it.
This is the time for entry. So you should start Levine College. There's a bunch of places that have closed. Really nice, small private liberal arts schools, 100 acres, nice physical plant, and you could rent them. If you can get somebody to donate $500 million to set you up for an endowment, use 10 million for initial startup, and then use the rest to generate income, you could have the university that you're thinking about. And it could be free. It could be no tuition. You can hire faculty and you can have people that are going to have this experience. You could pay faculty. So I actually think that there's going to be a big increase in the number of new efforts because of COVID to break the stranglehold that the elite universities have had. But so if we rank the 5 things, the one that's easy to peel off is teaching, because at most universities, teaching sucks. The professors are not good. They're not interested. They don't care. And so I'd like to think that I'm a good lecturer. But I also would say that a well-produced video from me is better than a live lecture from a professor who doesn't want to be there. And so if you look in New York, within just a few blocks, you can go to Broadway shows and to movie theaters. Those are really different experiences. But movie theaters are really great and they scale. And so we talked about this on Econ Talk. A lot of people saw Hamilton on Disney. And it wasn't the same thing. People are willing to pay to see it in person. I think that we can provide courses in a way that is on video that supplies the other 4. And after I said that, it turns out there are several small colleges in Australia that only provide the 4 things, and the courses are all provided on video. And students are paying quite a bit for this. It's a small college experiences. They have dinner together. They have social groups. They have meetings. They have clubs. But the courses are piped in. Now, the courses are expensive, and they're live. They're synchronous and remote. But it's easy to get somebody to teach that for 3 hours a week rather than to have someone in residence. So I think we can peel that off first. The second thing we can peel off is the clock tower, because having the shared experience of being in a class is worth something. After all, if you watch it at home on Netflix, you're by yourself. People will pay more money to go to a movie theater and watch it as a group. Now, it's just a movie. And you could watch it at home on Netflix, but they want to watch it as a group. I think classes may work that way also. It's just that we can schedule at any time. So classes and the clock tower, we probably can mess around with. I think the other 3 are pretty crucial. The tribalism, I don't know. At Harvard, Harvard has sports teams, and they play Yale every year in football. It's a big deal. There's like 7 people there under 60. So that's a pretty big deal.
I have a friend who was doing and he'll know who he is when he hears this. He was calling radio for Harvard basketball. And he told me that at one point, you could see how many people were watching, and the number was 4. Not his radio show, the actual telecast of the basketball game. But
the Harvard is sort of specialized. Brown is. Dartmouth was my first teaching job. And so Dartmouth was my experience in Ivy League school. It's different from a lot of it's so isolated, but still it's really focused on academics. But most universities, particularly the big state universities, tribalism is a big part of why people go there. So the other 3 probably are easy enough to keep as a bundle. And then you could pick and choose about the clock tower and courses. You could give people more flexibility, and it would be a heck of a lot cheaper.
Now, how valuable do you think? So of the other 3, right? The other 3 being your signal that you have something, whatever we want to call it, whether it's that you're cognitively elite, whether it's that you're polished, whatever it is, that you're going to be a good worker at whatever place you go, social life, and I'm forgetting what the third one was, but anyway.
Well, it's
tribalism, right? Yes, okay, tribalism. It was escaping me. All right, we're back. So of those 3, right, when you look at signaling, so another topic that came up is what that signal is actually worth, right? And Brian Caplan came up, who wrote an article suggesting that it's actually not worth all that much, that it's not so good. And one of the things you said in response to that was kind of funny. It was that it was like the Chinese civil service way back in the imperial era, where what was being signaled was actually your obedience to authority, and that you were willing to put a lot of effort into otherwise meaningless tasks.
You were smart, you could learn, and you would be compliant with a really stupid set of orders.
How valuable is that?
Because turns out it's really valuable. There's a lot of people working for consulting firms all over the United States that is the new Chinese calligraphy, working for McKinsey.
I do tend to agree with that.
Not that it's a bad thing. There's a set of things you're supposed to do. I know you will go off by yourself. You'll come back. They'll be done. The spreadsheet works.
So moving on from that, now when you look at the social life, right, and the term for it, I guess, would be assortative mating, which is, I think, a really useful way to look at it. Again, intuitive but not obvious. I think people often don't think about it like that. That you're in a position to find for yourself probably the most ideally suited mate pool that you're ever going to have in your life.
So it's both sexual and social. So yes, mate, but it's also mates in the Australian sense. You have friends that make a big difference.
How has that worked out? So in the Australian context you're talking about with smaller schools, maybe that works a little bit. When you look at it as my concern with as you unbundle is that people get more and more atomized. I think one of the things we've seen, a book I read recently was it's called The Decadent Society by Ross Douthat. He's at the New York Times, and it was a topic he talked about was the atomization of people being forced more and more online. And one of the interesting things he mentioned was the idea that people worried for a long time violent video games would make people more violent. What it turned out they actually did was just make people want to play violent video games more. Yeah. They didn't want to leave
by themselves or with a tribe of people they don't actually know.
Exactly. And I guess I would be curious. So as you unbundle this stuff further and further, do you think you run the risk of just doing that in 5 different ways as opposed to in one?
That is it. You have put your finger on the value proposition. So even at large universities, they have smaller groups, they have fraternities, they have social clubs. And these are groups where I'm president, vice president, treasurer, secretary. You get experience, and you're terrible at it, but you get experience in leadership. So these very small, many different decentralized groups that are formed around particular focus that may not really even stick. So my son was an AEPI at Duke. Graduated in 2014. He was pledge master his senior year. He still keeps in touch with the people who were first years. They have a really deep and close relationship. He learned leadership being a member of a fraternity. And so now a lot of it is what not to do, but you get to experiment with being in a leadership position. So at a very large university where you take big classes, or if you're just taking classes online, you don't get that. The reason universities will survive, bricks and mortar universities will survive, is precisely that social aspect. So both assortative mating and being in small groups where you get leadership experience. That's why bricks and mortar universities will survive, because classes, MOOCs, cannot offer that. And you can't do it cheaply. You actually have to have a physical place where you're isolated, and you have to put up with people you don't even like. We're in the same group, but we have to learn to work together. A lot of group projects in business are like that. I don't have to like these people. We have a shared purpose, and we're going to make this work. So college can be a really excellent introduction to that. We need to recognize that those things are important. There is a move, you said, that's becoming atomized. There is a move towards homogenization. This idea that if there are no groups, we'll hang out more together is wrong. We need groups. Now, there's a problem. It's exclusive. It's true. We're often little groups by ourselves. We segregate into little groups. That's a problem. But it's even worse to get rid of those groups entirely.
I think that's as good a stopping point as any we're going to come to. So I will just say thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Thanks very much. And if you have another topic in a month or two, I'd be happy to do it again.
Sounds great to me.